consciousness becomes a weight. Fernando Pessoa's hidden philosophy of suffering. There's a moment in every thinking person's life when they realize something terrifying. The more aware you become of yourself, the more you suffer. Most people live in blissful ignorance, moving through life without questioning the nature of their own existence. But Fernando Pessoa couldn't escape the weight of his own consciousness. He saw too deeply, felt too much, and understood things that perhaps humans aren't meant to understand. Today, we'll explore why consciousness can become the heaviest burden we carry, and how Pessoa's life reveals the hidden cost of truly knowing yourself. Fernando Pessoa lived what most would call an unremarkable life. Born in Lisbon in 1888, he worked as a translator, lived quietly, and died relatively unknown. But inside his mind, there was nothing quiet about Fernando Pessoa. He contained entire universes of consciousness. Pessoa didn't just write poetry, he created what he called heteronyms, complete alternative personalities, each with their own biography, writing style, and philosophical worldview. Alberto Caeiro, the shepherd poet who saw nature without metaphor. Ricardo Reis, the classical formalist obsessed with fate and the gods. Álvaro de Campos, the modern engineer torn between ecstasy and despair. These weren't pen names or creative exercises. For Pessoa, they were as real as he was, perhaps more real. But here's what makes this extraordinary. Pessoa was fully aware of what he was doing. He watched himself create these other selves. He observed his own mind fragmenting and multiplying. And in that observation, in that relentless self-awareness, he discovered something that most people never see. The self isn't one thing. It's not a solid, unchanging core that you can discover through introspection. The self is a crowd, a chaos, a constantly shifting theater of voices and impulses. And once you see this, once you become conscious of your own multiplicity, you can never unsee it. This is where consciousness becomes a weight. Most people believe that self-awareness is purely positive. Know thyself, the ancient Greeks said. The examined life is worth living, Socrates declared. But Pessoa lived the dark side of this wisdom. He saw that when you examine yourself too closely, when you become too conscious of your own mental processes, something breaks. The comfortable illusion of being a single, coherent person shatters. And what's left is a painful awareness of your own internal contradictions. Pessoa once wrote, "I've divided myself among various people. I've multiplied myself in order to feel myself. I've spread myself out in order to see myself." This wasn't poetic metaphor. This was the lived experience of a mind that had become too aware of its own workings. Every thought, every emotion, every impulse was observed, analyzed, fragmented into different perspectives. Imagine living like this. Imagine never being able to simply feel something without immediately watching yourself feel it, questioning the feeling, seeing it from multiple angles until the original emotion dissolves into confusion. This hyper-consciousness created a unique form of suffering. Pessoa felt like a stranger to life itself. He described himself as always being on the verge of waking up, but never quite managing it. He was present in the world, but not part of it, watching life happen, but unable to fully participate. This is the loneliness that comes with seeing too clearly. When you understand the constructed nature of identity, when you see through the illusions that make life bearable for others, you become isolated in your own awareness. But Pessoa discovered something else about consciousness. The more aware you become, the more you realize that suffering itself is not a problem to be solved, but a fundamental condition of conscious existence. He wrote, "To feel everything in every possible way, to have every experience possible to life, to be conscious of everything, and to be conscious of being conscious of everything." This sounds exhausting because it was. But for Pessoa, this exhaustion was also a form of completeness, a way of living that honored the full complexity of human consciousness. Most people protect themselves from this level of awareness. They maintain comfortable illusions about who they are. They avoid looking too deeply into the nature of their own minds. They stay busy enough to avoid confronting the fundamental questions of existence. And perhaps this is wise. Perhaps some level of unconsciousness is necessary for psychological survival, but Pessoa couldn't or wouldn't maintain these protective illusions. He felt compelled to explore every corner of his consciousness, no matter how painful the discoveries. This brings us to a crucial insight about consciousness itself. The ability to be aware of our own mental states, to observe our thoughts and feelings as they arise, is what makes us human. But this same ability can become a trap. When consciousness turns inward too intensely, when self-reflection becomes compulsive, we can become paralyzed by our own awareness. We become like Pessoa, watching ourselves live instead of actually living. Yet out of this suffering came extraordinary beauty. Pessoa's fragmented consciousness produced some of the most profound poetry ever written. His heteronyms weren't just literary devices. They were different ways of being human, different approaches to the fundamental problems of existence. Through them, he explored every possible response to consciousness. From Cairo's simple acceptance to Campos's tortured modernism to Race's stoic resignation. In fragmenting himself, he somehow managed to capture the totality of human experience. This reveals something important about the relationship between consciousness and creativity. The same awareness that can make life unbearable can also make it unutterably meaningful. The person who feels most deeply, who sees most clearly, who suffers most consciously, often produces the most lasting art. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because the intensity of conscious experience, even painful experience, connects us to something larger than ourselves. Pessoa understood that consciousness is both humanity's greatest gift and its heaviest burden. It allows us to create meaning, to connect with others across time and space, to transcend the limitations of our immediate experience. But it also condemns us to a kind of existential loneliness, to the painful awareness of our own mortality, to the impossible task of trying to understand ourselves completely. He wrote, "The painful thing is that we are neither the one we were nor the one we will be." Consciousness locks us into a permanent present where we're always aware of our own impermanence. So what can we learn from Pessoa's experience with the weight of consciousness? Perhaps that the goal isn't to become unconscious again, to retreat into comfortable illusions, but to find a way to bear the weight more lightly. Pessoa did this through his art, by transforming his fragmented consciousness into something beautiful and meaningful. But each of us has to find our own way to carry the burden of awareness. Maybe consciousness is heavy because it's supposed to be. Maybe the weight is what gives it value. A life without the burden of self-awareness might be easier, but it would also be emptier, less rich, less fundamentally human. The trick is not to avoid the weight, but to develop the strength to carry it with grace. Fernando Pessoa never solved the problem of consciousness. He lived with it, suffered with it, created with it, and ultimately was consumed by it. He died in 1935, leaving behind a trunk full of unpublished works, fragments of a mind that had spread itself across too many selves to ever fully cohere again. But in his failure to find a final answer, he left us something more valuable, a map of the territory we all must navigate as conscious beings. The weight of consciousness is real. It's the price we pay for being human, for being aware, for being able to reflect on our own existence. But perhaps the weight itself is part of what makes life meaningful. Perhaps carrying it well is the closest thing we have to wisdom. And perhaps, like Pessoa, we don't need to solve the problem of consciousness. We just need to learn to dance with it, to create something beautiful from its burden, to find in its weight not just suffering, but also the profound gift of being awake in an otherwise sleeping world.